So at Red Newt, we do all of our fermentations at this stage are pretty much what you would call spontaneous or indigenous fermentations. Those are kind of the kind of buzz terms in the industry. I personally prefer to call them feral fermentations. These are wild, untamed yeasts. They come from the vineyard or the cellar. We have no control, let's say, over them as far as like adding them to the wines. They're untamed, like I said. They just come and they start fermentations off, and we end up getting some really beautiful fermentations that I think have a little bit more ability to speak to the vineyard sites and the vintages that they come from as a result.
Yeah, the question of why do we work with yeast in this way when it's easy to inoculate is a complicated one. There's reasons to choose both paths. With our Rieslings in particular, we love what spontaneous yeast does. Somewhat because it helps express the site, but again, we don't know that the yeast are coming from the site. Frankly, they probably aren't. What we're getting instead is longer fermentation times, slower ferments, cooler ferments, and the result kind of lines up with what the Red Newt profile has been historically. Wines that age beautifully and need time in bottle to open up. That seems to be a real hallmark of what these spontaneous ferments do, these feral ferments do, and give us wines that we can be really proud of right out of the gate, but especially with a few years in bottle.
There is a certain amount of, let's say, concern sometimes when you're going with all spontaneous fermentations. This hasn't happened to us, but I've heard horror stories where the spontaneous fermentation, the feral yeast that takes off, is actually not a great yeast, and then you end up sometimes having to inoculate to take over those. Luckily for us at Red Newt, we have really healthy vineyard sites. The fruit that comes in is really clean, so we're not dealing with the pressure of having our spontaneous ferments go awry. We just kind of let those wild yeast come in and do what they will, and the result, I think, speaks for itself.
So what yeasts are we dealing with? The answer is that we don't actually know. We have sent samples off to labs, and they haven't been able to trace it to a specific cultured yeast or something that might have been in the cellar before, which is exciting for us. It also means that we really have to rely on our own kind of interpretation of the wines to recognize when different types of yeast are working. We're used to some of the fermentation aromatics that we get based on different yeasts in the cellar, in particular one that we jokingly call the afterburner, because it usually comes in the following spring, so a good 6 months after the wine has started to ferment, and the wine will go from being pretty slow in its fermentation rate, pretty sluggish, to suddenly fermenting really hard and almost wrapping up in a single weekend. So that's a really distinct yeast for our cellar. It's one that I wish we could bottle up and sell, but I guess we do in the wines that you have in your hand.